wonderful to see you all here. My name is Zacuto, and I'm the Vice President of J Street U Miami. J Street U Miami is a student organization fighting for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And we are thrilled to welcome you and senior commentator and acclaimed writer, Mr. Beinart to campus tonight for a wide-ranging discussion on the current state of Israel-Palestinian conflict and anti-Semitism. Please stick around later because we'll definitely be having a Q&A session after the discussion. Mr. Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's also a contributor to the Atlantic magazine, a fellow of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and as of last week, the editor-at-large for Jewish Currents magazine that some of you guys picked up earlier. He's the author of 3 books, including The Crisis of Zionism, which focuses on the issue of occupation in Israel-Palestine and the failure of the American Jewish establishment to speak up against it. Additionally, Mr. Beinart was editor of the New Republic magazine from 1996 to 2006, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the New York Review of Books, Slate magazine, Newsweek, Reader's Digest, and The Forward. Haaretz as well, and many other distinguished publications. Our chapter president, Jonah Karsh, will be conducting the interview, and so please again, welcome Mr. Beinart.
Can everybody hear me okay with this lapel mic? Awesome. I'm Jonah Karsh, as Jeremy said. Thank you all for coming. As you heard, we're J Street U. I know there are a lot of different levels of experience around this issue in the room and probably a lot of different viewpoints on the issue too. So I encourage everyone to have an open mind. I'm going to be asking Peter questions that come from both the left of what J Street supports and from the right of what J Street supports. So hopefully, if you have a question, it gets answered, and we're going to try to be cognizant of lots of different viewpoints. And of course, there's going to be a Q&A later on as well. Thank you all for being here, and I think we're just going to get started. Welcome, Mr. Beinart. Yeah. So one of the things that's really central to J Street U's understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we're going to start real basic for people that might not be as familiar, is just the concept of occupation, Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Can you just talk briefly about what the occupation is and your view of how it contributes to the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, and thank you, Jonah, for doing all the work to make this possible. So, Israel was founded in 1948, and in 1967, in the war in 1967, it conquered a series of new territories, including the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. And in the West Bank in particular, Israel, after the war, held on to that territory, but it didn't make the population of that territory, which was Palestinian, didn't make them citizens of Israel. To make them citizens of Israel would have caused a problem for a Jewish state, given that you would have essentially had millions of Palestinian non-Jewish citizens in a state that wanted to maintain its Jewish majority. And so Israel did not make this population citizens, but it put them under military law. And then the Israeli government kind of allowed, even encouraged, Israeli Jews to move themselves into the West Bank. And when they moved into the West Bank, they retained their Israeli citizenship. They remained living under Israeli law. So what you had was the creation in this territory of 2 groups of people in the West Bank, Jews, Israeli Jews and Palestinians, living in the same territory but under different legal systems. The Jews, as citizens of the state of Israel, had the right of citizenship, the right to vote for the Israeli government, the right to live under the same civil legal system as all other Israeli Jews in which they had due process, the right to free movement. The Palestinians were and are denied those things. They cannot vote for the government that controls their lives, which is the Israeli government. They need Israeli military permission to move, often from one part of the West Bank to the other, or certainly to move into Jerusalem or into Israel proper. They live under military law in which they can be held in indefinite detention, for instance. So if you go and see this up close, you see that the realities of living your entire life without basic rights, and without the basic rights that are enjoyed by your Jewish neighbors, is really quite brutal on the ground. Whether you like the term occupation or some other term, I don't think the terminology really matters. What matters is that as a matter of kind of fundamental human rights and basic principles of democracy and liberal democracy and equality under the law, there's something profoundly wrong with having one territory where two people live under different legal systems because of their inherited characteristics. The consequences of holding this population for now more than a half century, I think, has been deeply morally corrupting, not only for Israel, but I would argue even for the organized American Jewish community that has in various ways tried to defend what I think is this indefensible state of affairs.
Going off of that a little bit, would you be able to talk a little bit about America's role, its relationship with Israel, its relationship with the Palestinians, and the current administration and past administrations' attitudes towards the conflict, and maybe more specifically the occupation?
Sure. The United States is Israel's ally and benefactor. The relationship became particularly strong in the 1960s. So what that means is the United States gives Israel more, close to $3.8 billion in military aid per year, and also tends to defend Israel in international forums like the United Nations. The United States, since the Clinton administration, since the 1980s, has been on record as supporting a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and in East Jerusalem. And the United States has given some aid to the Palestinian Authority, which acts as kind of, you could say, Israel's subcontractors in the West Bank, keeping things in control on the ground. But in reality, a Clinton administration negotiator named Aaron David Miller described America's role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as serving as Israel's lawyer. If you look at the history, even before Donald Trump, I think you generally tend to find that the United States has tended to support Israel over the Palestinians and essentially protect Israel from facing consequences for their behavior. And now we see with the Trump administration that taken to much, much greater extremes than we've ever seen before. So the Trump administration has cut off all U.S. aid to the Palestinians, including aid to the refugee agency that provided much of the education and health care in Gaza and other places with large refugee populations. It's expelled the Palestinian representation from Washington. It said that settlements, in its view, are not illegal under international law. And now it is essentially, basically kind of given Israel a green light to annex part of the West Bank and kind of delivered a peace plan recently, some of you may call it in the news, which essentially allows Israel to control all of the land in the settlements that Israel has taken since 1967, and essentially says that Palestinians therefore can have a series of kind of non-contiguous Palestinian population areas that they might connect through bridges and tunnels, but with Israel controlling all the land in between, with Palestinians not having access to East Jerusalem, which would be like, I don't know, the New York equivalent would be like having a country in Westchester that couldn't get into Manhattan, right? East Jerusalem is the kind of cultural and commercial capital of the West Bank, so no Palestinian state without access to East Jerusalem could ever hope to be viable. And the peace plan has also said that even some of Israel's own Palestinian citizens, because Israel proper, the country that was created in 1948, has about 20% of its citizens are Palestinian. And the Trump administration peace plan has said that what the Israeli government could do would basically be slightly redraw its boundaries, so essentially to take some of those Palestinian citizens and basically deposit them outside of Israel and essentially take away their citizenship, denationalize it. Which is and so this is the most extreme version, I think, we've seen of the United States' lack of concern for Palestinian rights, and it's perceived by some in the organized American Jewish community as an extremely pro-Israel plan, but I ultimately don't think it's in Israel's long-term interest either. I don't think it's actually pro-Israel at all, since ultimately I don't think it is in the long-term interest of Israel to control millions of people who lack basic rights. I think that's simply a recipe for endless conflict a conflict which is having already, I think, having a very corrosive effect inside Israel. Israel and Palestine is a very small territory, and ultimately, the lives of Israelis are bound up with the lives of Palestinians, and the notion that it is in Israel's long-term interest, in the long-term welfare of Israeli Jews, to have an increasingly desperate and oppressed and hopeless Palestinian population. Even if you actually look at many of Israel's own security officials, one of the things that they say is that it is a threat to Israeli security for Palestinians not to have hope of living a dignified life with basic rights.
Yeah, so there is a consensus, at least in the left of center discourse and from former officials in previous administrations that have spoken out, that this peace plan is not good for the Israelis, it's not good for the Palestinians, it's not fair to the Palestinians. With that understanding, if we take that understanding for granted, there are people that aren't taking it for granted. There are lots of major American Jewish organizations that have either come out in support of the plan, have stayed silent, not taken a position on the plan, but the Trump administration thought this was the right thing to do. And can you talk about what you think the thought process of the Trump administration was in deciding this, and what the interests at stake were?
I mean, I think for Donald Trump, much of politics is really transactional, and ultimately it's about what's in it for him. And I think you have a kind of policy that all presidents think about their political interests when making policy, but you also have a governmental apparatus made up of career professionals in places like the State Department and the National Security Council, whose job is to think about what's in the national interest and to balance that against the political interests of the president becoming too overwhelming. And in the Trump administration, that process is really broken down. So you had this plan really being written in secret, it appears, by Jared Kushner and David Friedman, neither of whom have any diplomatic or academic experience with this subject at all, right? Friedman was Trump's bankruptcy lawyer, who went to court when Trump's casinos in New Jersey went bankrupt, right? His views are extremely typical, I would say, of people of his demographic, many of whom I know very well. But they don't come from any real, I think, lived experience, and certainly no actual experience with Palestinians. Similarly, Jared Kushner. I mean, imagine how America, right? So you have basically the three most influential advisors on this being Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, Jason Greenblatt, who was his real estate attorney, and David Friedman, who was his bankruptcy attorney, right? All Orthodox Jews, all with quite right-wing views on Israel, with no Palestinians involved in this process at all, right? I mean, imagine how American Jews would feel, right, if you had a peace plan that was hatched. Imagine Barack Obama, right, that his daughter, Malia, had converted to Islam, married a Palestinian Muslim man. And that man had been put in charge of the writing the Israeli-Palestinian peace process alongside two of Obama's Palestinian Muslim business associates, and no Jews had been part of the process, right? I think Jews might feel a little bit alienated by that experience, right? I think it's just a kind of basic principle of life that if you want to try to come up with an answer to a problem that is fair to both sides, you bring both sides into the conversation, right? There was no attempt made at this at all, and now we've seen actually that just what many Israeli security officials predicted, which was that this would increase the chances of violence. We've now seen in the last couple of days more violence in the West Bank. And again, if you look at what many of Israel's own security officials have talked about, they draw a direct line between Palestinian hopelessness and violence. And so as you do things that make Palestinians more and more hopeless and more desperate, the chances of violence increase. That's not a defense of violence. I don't believe in violence. It's not a moral defense, but it's an explanation. Hopeless people, desperate people, are people who are more likely to turn to violence, which is not good for Palestinians and not good for Israeli Jews. And it is a very dangerous fallacy to believe that this is a zero-sum conflict in which the more Israel wins and the more Palestinians lose, the better it is for Israel. Just to take a small example, right? The Gaza Strip right now has been, the United Nations said that the Gaza Strip would be unlivable for human beings by the year 2020, in part because there was very little drinkable water, among other things, because they don't have the electricity that's necessary to desalinate water in the West Bank. So you have a large population in the Gaza Strip that's now living in truly, truly horrific circumstances. Gaza is not very far down the beach from the Israeli cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon and ultimately to Tel Aviv. So if you have a cholera epidemic that's coming out of Gaza, which some have suggested is possible, that could affect Israel. Israel's own desalinization plants have had to shut down a couple of times now because of the toxic wastewater that is coming downstream from Gaza, right? This is a small territory in which ultimately I truly very much believe that the safety and dignity of Israeli Jews is bound up with the safety and dignity of Palestinians. And this notion of seeing the welfare of these two populations as interconnected, I think is what's been completely lost in the Trump and the Netanyahu governments.
Well said, well said. Is my mic still working for everybody? Yeah. Okay, great. Let's turn back to the United States. It's clear that you're not a fan of Trump's plan. You also, in your first piece for Jewish Currents, after joining them a couple weeks ago, you wrote about Joe Biden's record on Israel in his role in the Obama administration as vice president. And you were not a fan of that. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw as the problems with Joe Biden's role, and also, as we dive into the caucus primary season, which Democratic candidates you think are addressing these important concerns that are going to get us back in the right direction towards peace against occupation?
So, the argument that I made based on some reporting in that piece about Joe Biden was that in the moments during the Obama administration where Barack Obama moved tentatively towards potentially putting pressure on Israel, particularly on the question of settlement expansion, that Joe Biden opposed him and in some ways actually undercut him. So for instance, if some of you may remember at the very end of the Obama administration abstained on a Security Council resolution on settlements, condemning settlement growth. Joe Biden argued internally against doing that. He wanted the United States to veto it. In the first 2 years of the Obama administration, where the Obama administration tried to limit Israeli settlement growth in order to create a context for negotiations that they hoped would lead to a Palestinian state, when the United States tried to put pressure on Netanyahu to actually implement a genuine settlement freeze, Joe Biden undermined the efforts of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to pressure Benjamin Netanyahu in that regard. So, to my mind, Joe Biden will be a step backward on this issue. What's interesting that's happened in the Democratic Party is that Bernie Sanders in particular has gone and taken a set of positions that are far beyond what most Democratic politicians have taken in the past. First of all, he's talked very forthrightly in a way that most American politicians don't about Palestinian rights, about the situation in Gaza, and used his megaphone to kind of bring to light the conditions that Palestinians face in a way that very few American politicians have done. And he's also said, which I think is right, that for America to play a constructive role, America has to stop allowing Israel to pursue these policies in a state of impunity, that America can't continue to be complicit. So he has argued that the United States should condition, he hasn't been specific about how, but that the United States should think about conditioning its military aid so that it conditions those military aids on certain changes in Israeli behavior. I myself have written about how that might be done a little bit. I'm not in favor of cutting off all U.S. military aid to Israel. I think there are important functions for U.S. military aid, for instance, to things like Iron Dome, which protect Israelis from rocket fire. But I don't think there's any reason that American money needs to be used, for instance, to demolish Palestinian homes in the West Bank, particularly when many Palestinian homes are demolished, not because the Palestinians have done anything except for not be able to get building permits that as non-citizens under military law they can't get, or for instance American money going to detain Palestinian children, There have been hundreds of Palestinian children who've been detained in the West Bank, often taken from their homes in the middle of the night, blindfolded, shackled, held for sometimes days without access to a lawyer, without their parents knowing where they are. This is not something that American taxpayer money should be used to pay for. And so I think Sanders has opened that conversation. Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg have more tepidly kind of flirted with the idea of some kind of eighth conditionality, but I think that what happens in the presidential primary will have a huge impact on the future course of the Democratic Party on this issue. The better Bernie Sanders does, the more it will be a signal to other Democrats that they can take these positions and survive politically. That the fear that many Democrats have had about the political consequences of taking these positions actually have been have been exaggerated, and I think that would be very, very valuable. Again, I don't think that America is doing. I don't think it's in our national interest, and I don't think it doesn't benefit Palestinians, and I also don't believe it benefits Israel for us to essentially give Israel a green light to continue on a path that is brutal for Palestinians and ultimately reckless and I think dangerous for Israel itself.
Great, great. So I want to steer this in another direction. Maybe there are some people in the audience that are thinking, man, Peter is very critical of Israel. That's true. I want to ask sort of a broader question about your relationship to Israel. You're a very observant Jew. You lead services in an Orthodox synagogue, if I'm not mistaken.
I do. Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, you do. And there's this idea of Zionism that a lot of people have heard. Some people on the left think of Zionism as sort of a curse word, but it means a lot of different things. I think some people think of it as meaning just supporting the right of a Jewish state to exist. Some of it think Zionism means supporting all the policies of the Israeli state. You wrote a book called The Crisis of Zionism, and in that book, you say that you are a Zionist and you're proud to be a Zionist. Can you talk about why you are a Zionist, what Zionism means to you, but also how you've struggled with your Zionism?
Sure. So even a kind of cursory familiarity with Jewish texts will show you that the Jewish connection to the land of Israel is quite profound. I mean, Jews pray multiple times a day, if you're an observant Jew, in various different forms, and for a return to Jerusalem, and the word for Jerusalem, the biblical word for Jerusalem, is Zion. Much of the Jewish history was created in large measure. Virtually the entire book of Genesis takes place in the land of Israel. So the Jewish history is inextricably bound up with the land of Israel. But when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD and after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135, Jews were kind of dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, ultimately around the world, and really in large measure because of the pain actually of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the rabbis who wrote the Talmud came to the conclusion that Jews should not try to recreate a Jewish country until Messianic time. That should ultimately be in God's hands to bring the Jews back to Israel and not in the hands of human actors. But in the 19th century, nationalism swept across Europe. You had the collapse of these large multinational, multi-ethnic empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German, Russian empires, and lots of different nations. The Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the Hungarians, the Romanians were all looking to carve out their own states, countries that would express their desire for safety and also for national self-representation. And so the Jews of Europe kind of looked around and said, well, where does this leave us, right? We're not really considered Hungarians and Lithuanians and Ukrainians by and large, even though we live with these people. The dream that many had, like Theodor Herzl himself, the founder of political Zionism, had of a modern liberal Europe in which Jews would be accepted simply as Europeans, was ultimately dashed by the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the early 20th century. And so people like Herzl and others basically said, we need our own nationalist project. And then the question was, well, where would this nationalist project take shape? Where would the Jewish nation be if Jews tried to carve out a country of their own? Herzl, who was an extremely assimilated Jew, actually was open to it being in all kinds of different places. Uganda, potentially South America, any place where he felt Jews could go to be safe and to kind of create a national culture of their own. But because of the depth of the Jewish historic connection and religious connection to the land of Israel, he quickly realized that the only place that most Eastern European Jews could imagine a Jewish nationalism taking shape would be in the land of Israel, what Jews call the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And while that was a deeply controversial idea among Jews in Europe, there were many religious Jews in the first half of the 20th century who believed it was a violation of Jewish law to return and to try to create a state of Israel. There were others who remained believers in communism or socialism or liberalism and wanted multi-ethnic states in Europe. That the Holocaust, in a certain kind of way, settled the question, right? It made Jews believe, and most Jews believe in the great necessity of a state of Jewish self-protection, a state that would allow Jews who were threatened to come to when the rest of the world had basically not allowed Jews in their moment of peril to emigrate. So the idea that you would have one country in the world in the land of Israel that had the Jewish self-protection as its mission statement was a very, very powerful idea, and after the creation of the State of Israel, really became a kind of a near consensus idea among Jews in the diaspora and, of course, in Israel itself. I call myself a Zionist because I believe in the importance of a Jewish community in the land of Israel. There's a strand of cultural Zionism associated with the thinker of Achad Ha'am, which didn't actually even need to suggest that Zionism requires a Jewish state, but does believe in the centrality of a Jewish community in the land of Israel. Think about how important the reestablishment of a large Jewish community in the land of Israel has been to the Jewish people. First of all, it's meant the recreation of Hebrew as a living language, right? That itself is just of enormous significance to Jews around the world. I also think that in a post-Holocaust world, in which anti-Semitism, as we have seen, remains remarkably and sadly resilient, even in places where one doesn't expect it to emerge, that there is something important about having a country in the world that sees the protection of Jewish life as its mission statement. When I was, in high school, going to college, the Israeli government sent airplanes to save the Jews in Ethiopia, who were a desperately poor and persecuted population, because of the sense that a Jewish state has a responsibility to protect and look after vulnerable Jews around the world. To me, that's an important principle, and that's why I call myself a Zionist. But it is also, it seems to me, undeniable, if one wants to be honest, that there's a real tension between the notion of a state that has a special obligation to protect and represent Jews, and the principles of equality under the law, in which everyone should be equal in the eyes of the state, right? Because again, even putting aside the West Bank, even inside Israel proper, 20% of Israel's own citizens are not Jewish. They often get called Arab Israelis, but really they're Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? And so they're not going to feel particularly well represented by a country that has a Jewish star on its flag, whose national anthem talks about the Jewish soul, right? Just the American Jews would not feel particularly well represented by an American flag that had a cross and or more American national anthem that talked about Jesus Christ. So what I believe is that Israel has to evolve its identity in such a way to become more inclusive of its Palestinian citizens. That even if Israel were to end the occupation, it would still have a great deal of work to do in creating an Israeli identity that both protects and represents Jews. I don't think there's anything wrong with in Israel the day of rest, the day of rest being Saturday, which is the Jewish Shabbat, just like in the United States, which is a majority Christian society, that oftentimes stores tend to close on Sunday. That's okay. But I think Israel has to go a long ways towards making its Palestinian citizens feel equally treated. So for instance, I would add language to Israel's national anthem, to make it speak to Palestinian citizens so they feel represented by these symbols. I think Israel's immigration policy, which was created during the formation of the state, which means that an American Jew like me can go and become a citizen on day one, but it means that a Palestinian, even a Palestinian who was born in Israel, cannot gain citizenship in Israel. So that my friend Youssef, for instance, who was born inside Israel, his wife is from the West Bank, she cannot come and live with him in Israel and become a citizen there. That seems to me too far. That seems to me a violation of basic principles of fairness and equality under the law that we should care about. So this is the way in which I try to balance my Zionism with my belief in liberal democracy. I think it just, parenthetically, it's worth noting, Israel is not the only country in the world that has certain special privileges and representation for particular ethnic or religious groups. There are a lot of countries in the world, Germany, for instance, Poland, that have preferential immigration policies for people of a particular ethnic group. There are a lot of countries in the world that have crosses on their flags. Britain has a cross on its flag. Many European countries have crosses on their flags. So I don't think the fact that Israel has a Jewish character is inherently disqualifying of the Zionist project, but the way in which Israel has progressed, certainly under Benjamin Netanyahu, has moved it further and further away, I think, from the principles of liberal democracy that I think that are important to me, that I think should be important to all people, and that I also think are very important to my interpretation of what Jewish tradition calls us to support.
Well said. That said, there are some...
Like, I don't usually get compliments from the moderator.
There are people that would say, in spite of all that you said, that the human rights violations are so much that Zionism in and of itself has to go.
Right.
And maybe we would call those people anti-Zionists.
Sure.
Or someone who doesn't support the idea of a Jewish state.
Right.
Israel is an anti-Zionist.
Right.
The Trump administration in December released an executive order, maybe some of you saw it in the news. There was a lot of things about it defining Judaism as a nationality. But more specifically, one of the things that I found important about the executive order, and that Jared Kushner, one of the architects of the executive order, actually wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times, is that this executive order makes it clear, codifies, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Right, right.
You have written a column that says anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Can you talk about why you disagree and why you think that?
Sure. I don't think anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism. That's not to say there aren't anti-Zionists who are also anti-Semites. But of course there are. You know, David Duke is an anti-Zionist and an anti-Semite. Louis Farrakhan is an anti-Zionist and an anti-Semite. There are also Zionists who are anti-Semites, right? I mean, Donald Trump is a Zionist, and yet he said far more anti-Semitic things than, you know, Ilhan Omar or Rashid Tlaib on their worst day, right? Some of the most anti-Semitic leaders in the world, Viktor Orban, who's kind of led this crudely anti-Semitic attack on George Soros, is a very big supporter of the state of Israel. Arthur Balfour, who wrote the Balfour Declaration, which said Britain supported the idea of a Jewish national home, right? So I mean, I know Jews who are actually named for Arthur Balfour, was a huge anti-Semite, right? He basically supported the anti-immigration laws that shut down British Jewish immigration to Britain. Because if you think about it, being an anti-Semite and anti-Zionist is not inherently contradictory. If you don't want Jews in your country, you might actually be very supportive of the idea of them having a country of their own so they have somewhere to go. The Polish government in the 1930s, which was pretty anti-Semitic, actually helped to train Zionist militia groups, the Irgun and Beitar militias, on Polish military bases because they wanted Jews to have their own state, so the Polish Jews would leave Poland, right? So I think that it's important to remember that anti-Semitism can show up in Zionist or anti-Zionist guise. There are a bunch of problems with describing anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. One of which is that there have always been Jewish anti-Zionists. There are not as many of them today as they were in the first half of the 20th century, when it was probably a majority of world Jews were anti-Zionist, but many ultra-Orthodox Jews, for instance, the Satmar Hasidim, you know, who have rallies that are bigger than the AIPAC convention, are overwhelmingly anti-Zionist because they still hold to the Talmud's interpretation of the idea that you should not recreate Jewish sovereignty until Messianic times. There were famous Jewish in the middle of the 20th century, like Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber and Henrietta Schultz, who founded Hadassah, all of whom believed in a binational state, not a Jewish state. They weren't anti-Semites, right? Just like the Satmar Rebbe is not an anti-Semite. And if the more the two-state solution dies, the larger the percentage of Jews in the diaspora, including young American Jews, who question the idea of Jewish statehood and instead support one equal secular binational state will be, right? Those numbers will grow, and those Jewish kids will not all of a sudden become anti-Semites because they decide that they prefer one equal state under one law to a Jewish state which holds millions of Palestinians without basic rights. But the biggest problem, I think, with calling anti-Zionism anti-Semitism is that it silences and dehumanizes Palestinians. It is, I think, understandable, given the Jewish experience of centuries of oppression culminating in a genocide, that many Jews would have a natural affinity for the idea of Zionism and a Jewish state. It is also entirely understandable, given the Palestinian experience, that Palestinians would see Zionism as something that has wreaked tremendous destruction among their people and their families, right? It was the creation of a Jewish state that led to led 700,000 or so Palestinians to be forced from their homes in between 1947 and 1949. You're not going to find many Palestinian families that were not touched by that catastrophe which Palestinians call the Nakba. You're not going to find many Palestinians who do not have relatives who are living, whose experience with Jewish statehood has been an experience of tremendous persecution. And again, even Palestinian citizens of Israel, those Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, cannot in a Jewish state tell their children, you can grow up to be prime minister of this country, which is something that anyone wants to be able to tell their children. So the Jews and Palestinians may look at things from different perspectives given our different histories, but I think it's fundamentally important that we try to learn from one another, and we learn from the experience of one another, and we respect the basic humanity of one another. You know, it says in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, there's a line which says, who is wise? The one who learns from all people, right? We have a lot to learn. Jews have a lot to learn from the Palestinian experience, right? And the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism conflation is exactly the opposite. It's to say not only that your perspective is inherently bigoted, and therefore we can silence it, we can even criminalize it, right? Which is dehumanizing, and it also keeps us stupid because we need to hear from Palestinians. We need to be in conversation with Palestinians for our own humanity and for our own knowledge. And my fear is that the rise of this equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is in many ways a response to the potential death of the two-state solution. As the death of the two-state solution leads more people to say, well, the best answer now would seem to me to be one equal state that is not a Jewish state. And because the organized American Jewish community and Israeli government are afraid of that argument, their response to it is essentially to say that argument is bigotry, and therefore it cannot be legitimately expressed. Which means, in a kind of very Orwellian way, that all you are left with is the reality we have now, a Jewish state in which millions of Palestinians lack basic rights. That's supposed to be the non-bigoted alternative, right? Where millions of people live under a different legal system because of their ethnicity and religion, right? And this, it seems to me, is the deep problem with this equation.
Does anybody have the time?
7:49.
7:49. I want to ask you a couple more questions very briefly, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience. I wanted to talk about, a lot of people will hear what you've said and say, it's true that there's Palestinian suffering, but peace isn't worth it. And there are a few things that they say, and most of them come up to that the Palestinians aren't a partner for peace, they're not up for it. There are people that argue that Israel has offered the Palestinians a state 5 or 6 times, 10 times, and they've said no every time. There are people that have argued that when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, when the Israeli military left that Palestinian territory, that then the Palestinians elected Hamas, a terrorist organization, that if you try to make peace with the Palestinians and it doesn't work, that the only thing that will happen is terrorism, and that in order to protect Jewish security, peace isn't worth it. I take it you don't agree with that. In J Street, we don't really agree with that. Can you talk about why you think peace is still worth it and respond to some of those points?
Sure. First, let me talk about the Gaza story, which gets thrown out a lot inside the American Jewish community. I think the critical thing to understand about what happened in Gaza was that there was no peace agreement in Gaza. The Palestinians were not, again, it was in some ways not like the Kushner peace plan. The Palestinians were never consulted. There was never an agreement made. Yes, Ariel Sharon, for reasons of his own, in large measure because he was afraid of pressure for a two-state solution, decided that Israel would remove its settlers from Gaza. And that unilateral withdrawal then led to a Palestinian election in which Hamas won a plurality of the vote. It won a plurality of the vote mostly because the Palestinian Authority had been governing for 10 years and had been corrupt and incompetent, and people, as they often do, when they're unhappy with their government, they voted for the alternative. And then Israel and the United States basically unwilling to accept the result of that election, and a Palestinian unity government, which is what Abbas himself wanted, basically went in and tried to overturn the results of that election by force. But the point is that unilateral withdrawals are fundamentally different than peace agreements, because peace agreements are agreements between two sides in which you go through a negotiating process and both sides agree because both sides feel like they've gotten something. Israel's unilateral withdrawals from Lebanon and from the Gaza Strip have not been that. That's why I don't favor a unilateral Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, because it would never meet minimum Palestinian demands. Israeli peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt have held for decades. They've served Israel very well. Even when there was an election in Egypt that elected a Muslim Brotherhood president and then a counter-revolution and a military coup, the peace agreements with Egypt have held because the Egyptians fundamentally, they got something important from it, just like the Jordanians did. So I think it's a mistake to use a unilateral withdrawal as the basis of imagining what would happen with a peace agreement. People say that Israel made all these offers to the Palestinians and the Palestinians said no. That is half of the story, right? The other half of the story, which doesn't get told very much in the Jewish community, is that the Palestinians made offers to Israel that Israel rejected, right? Which is another way of saying that the Palestinians and the Israeli negotiators differed on a set of issues, right? If I say I'm willing to buy your house for $500,000, and you only want to sell me, then you have rejected my offer. If you want to sell to me for $1 million, I've rejected your offer, right? It doesn't make me any more rejectionist than you. If you look at, there was simply a disagreement between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators on a series of issues. One of them was the amount of territory that Israel would annex in a peace agreement. The Israeli negotiators, whether it was Ehud Barak in 2000 and 2001, or Ehud Omer in 2007 and 2008, always wanted to annex between 6 and 10% of the West Bank. Why? Because they didn't feel they could evacuate all of these settlements. They felt that they needed to incorporate some of the big settlements into Israel because they feared that basically if they tried to annex to evacuate too many settlers, it would bring Israel to the brink of civil war. Remember, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated before he evacuated even a single settlement, right? And so the Palestinians, on the other hand, said, okay, you want to, for instance, incorporate the settlement of Ariel in this peace agreement. But Ariel stretches virtually halfway across the West Bank and basically cuts the northern West Bank off from the rest of the West Bank. It undermines the territorial contiguity of our state. Therefore, we can't accept that. The Palestinians were okay with about a 2% land swap, not with a 6 or 8 or 10% land swap. The Palestinians wanted a capital in all of the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. None of the Israeli governments were willing to allow the Palestinians to have, they were willing to allow, Barak was willing to allow the Palestinians to have a say in some of the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, but not all of them. The Israeli governments wanted to keep an Israeli military presence for, in Barak's case, 12 years in the Jordan Valley. The Palestinians said, if you have troops on our land for 12 years, we're not really a sovereign state if you can keep troops there against our will, right? So, again, these were negotiated agreements. I think one of the key things to understand about these differences is the more settlements you build in the West Bank, the harder you make it to bridge those differences, right? Because the harder it then becomes for Israel to ever allow a truly viable, contiguous Palestinian state. The further you move the two parties apart, till you ultimately get to the Kushner proposal, which is basically to say Israel keeps all of the land, and the Palestinians have about half of the West Bank in disconnected, isolated cantons, and they can call it a state, they can call it an empire for all they care, but it's not actually really anything that any of us would accept for a state, and not anything that can actually bring real prosperity or dignity to Palestinians. So that would be how I would respond to some of those.
Great. So one last question.
Sorry, the PLO, by the way, is worth noting. The PLO is the Palestinian Liberation, for people who say that Palestinians will never accept Israel's right to exist. It is true that Hamas has not accepted Israel's existence as it, but the PLO in 1988, and then publicly at the beginning of the Oslo Accords in 1993, accepted the legitimacy of Israel within its 1967 borders, and that was without even getting a state, right? So again, the notion that Palestinians have not been willing to accept Israel's existence, I think actually isn't borne out by a kind of a close reading of what actually happened.
Okay, and just very quickly, so that we can get to questions. We have a lot of students in the room, we just got very deep into the details, but I think one of the things that is at J Street's understanding of the core of this is that you don't need to know all these historical details. All you need to do is see the occupation and see that it's unjust and that it's a human rights crisis. And the Democratic Party in 2016 in their Democratic Party platform didn't include any language that was acknowledging the occupation. And we, in J Street, right, this year we're doing a campaign to get that language into the party platform. Are you in support of that language? and more broadly, what do you think students on this campus can do to push for human rights for everyone in Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party thinks of itself as a party that believes in human rights and equality, and has a particular concern for people who have been in the past been denied basic rights, whether that's African Americans or LGBT folks or Latinos or Muslims, and it seems to me that it is fundamentally inconsistent with that basic ethic that the Democratic Party prides itself on, to not also believe in the fundamental rights and dignity of Palestinians, and to be, therefore, complicit in Israel's denial of those rights. Doesn't mean that the Democratic Party has to be hostile to Israel. I don't want the Democratic Party to be hostile to Israel. But a party that is concerned about human rights cannot, it seems to me, in good conscience, write a blank check to a government that is denying those rights in part with U.S. money. And it certainly should not, it should, at the very least, should be willing to speak truthfully about that denial of basic rights, and to say that they're antithetical to the values that the party believes in. And I think that students have a really big, important role to play here. I think that the American, in my experience, what is holding Democratic politicians back from being willing to take positions like the conditioning of military aid, like talking frankly about the reality of the denial of basic Palestinian rights, is not conviction so much as political fear. Fear about a political system in which they feel that they will pay a huge price for taking these positions. And it is within your power to change those political realities, to make it possible for people, I think, actually to speak their conscience, to go and see for themselves, and to try to apply the basic values that they hold about the United States to Israel and Palestine. And I think we have a particular moment now in that we have a Democratic presidential campaign in which we have candidates who are actually trying to open up that conversation, and we have also groups that are trying to shut that conversation down, right? A group called Democratic Majority for Israel, which is essentially a kind of an AIPAC-like group in the Democratic Party, ran ads against Bernie Sanders in Iowa, right? They weren't running those ads because they don't like his health care plans, right? They were running those ads because they're afraid that he might shift the Democratic Party's position on Israel. And that's a political act, and people need to respond to it, it seems to me, with political activism.
Wonderful. So we're going to open it up for questions. I think we're going to have time for maybe 4 or 5 questions. We want to prioritize students, so if we have student questions first, that's great. We ask that it's a question, not a comment, and that you try to keep it brief so that we get as many in as we can. And also, Isaac in the back is going to come up and grab a microphone. We have some people, just so that someone knows, we ask that you use the microphone when you're asking the questions. So, if anyone has any, feel free to raise your hand. You can choose that.
Thank you. So could you talk a little bit about like the history of Palestinian like national identity? Because that's something that I've always been a little confused about. Because I mean, I've always looked at the issue from a Jewish standpoint, and so I've never really understood when kind of like at what point did, because I think the Palestinian, like the whole area came from the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
So I would like to understand a little bit more about when did Palestinians start getting together and say, hey, we want a state also.
Right. So that's a great question, right? So one of the things you sometimes, if you spend time in the Jewish community, you might have heard is that Palestinians are kind of an invented people. They're not a real people, right? They're basically just generic Arabs, right? And they'll say, the Palestinian identity doesn't stretch back for millennia like Jewish identity, right? But in reality, Palestinian identity emerged in the same way that most post-colonial identities emerge, right? Which is to say that European powers divided up the Middle East into states, right? Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, right? And then, in response to European colonialism, nationalisms emerged based on those territorial formations, right? So Palestinian nationalism is no more invented or illegitimate than Nigerian nationalism, or Tanzanian nationalism, right? Or Indonesian nationalism. These are all based on arbitrary European drawn, but they take on a meaning because these people share a particular experience, right, of being under this particular colonial power, which in the case of the Palestinians was Britain, right? Britain was basically given the colonial mandate after the Ottoman Empire collapsed during World War I, right? Palestinian national identity emerges in the dual struggles against British colonialism and also against the rival nationalism of Zionism as more Jews make Aliyah to Israel and try to create a Palestinian state, right? So I think Palestinian nationalism really isn't that complicated, really, and it is, and if we see it in comparative context, it becomes, I think, an entirely understandable.
Great. More questions?
So I'm a Palestinian woman, and I definitely recognise the need for a Jewish state. You mentioned that Palestinians, and I could be wrong, but the impression that I got was that Palestinians should be striving for Israeli citizenship, why can it not be that Jews are granted citizenship under a Palestinian government? Yeah.
Great question. Okay, so what I meant was, in a two-state solution, you would have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with its capital in East Jerusalem, right? And the Palestinians, and those Palestinians would be Palestinians of that state. But you would still have 20% of Israel citizens inside what's called the Green Line, inside Israel proper, who are now Israeli citizens. If they wanted to move to a Palestinian state, they could, but they also, many of them want to remain as Israeli citizens, right? And they deserve the right to be treated equally as Israeli citizens. I also think that it's important that if Jews want to remain in the West Bank, that they have the right to live safely and equally in a Palestinian state. Right? I think that both a Jewish and Palestinian state must be based on the principle that the other group has the right to live safely and with dignity and with rights in that state. So that was all that I was suggesting.
Hey, so could you elaborate maybe on what the actual difference is for people living there would be between maybe like a secular one-state solution versus the two-state, which is what J Street and many other organizations seem to lean towards.
Right. So in a two-state solution, you partition the territory, right? So basically, again, you have the West Bank and Gaza become a Palestinian state. Jerusalem, the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem become the capital of that Palestinian state, and Israel remains a Jewish state. The advantages of that are that there seems to be a strong desire for national self-determination and statehood among both Palestinians and Israeli Jews, right? Israeli Jews, certainly most of them want there to be a Jewish state. the Palestine Liberation Organization, the kind of the umbrella body for Palestinian nationalism, wants a Palestinian state, right? That's its stated position. We want a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with its capital in Jerusalem. The downside of a Palestinian state are, first of all, it seems harder and harder to achieve, right? As Israel takes more and more of the territory in which a Palestinian state would be created. It also means it's a very, very, it's a bitter pill for Israeli Jews in the sense that they may feel that they are no longer going to have access, they may feel, to territories in the West Bank that are very religiously significant for Jews, right? Much of the most biblically precious land in between the Mediterranean and the Jordan for Jews actually is in the West Bank, right? The city of Hebron, for instance, which according to Jewish tradition is where Abraham and Isaac and Leah and Sarah and Rebecca are all buried, and Adam and Eve according to Jewish tradition, right? So that, and for Palestinians, it's even more bitter pill to swallow, right? The two-state solution is very, very painful, even though it's what the Palestinian National Movement now says it wants. It is essentially saying we're going to accept a state in 22% of what was British mandatory Palestine, right? And it means that there probably would be lots of Palestinians who don't come from the West Bank and Gaza, whose families come from inside Israel itself, from Jaffa or from Haifa or from other places, who might not be able to return, right? So that's why the idea of the two-state solution has been very controversial and divisive among Palestinians. The idea of one equal state in all of this territory, right, has the advantage that, in theory, then people would be able to live in any part of this territory they wanted equally. The disadvantage from a Jewish perspective is that there would not be a state that had Jewish self-protection as its mission statement. The other potential, I think, big potential problem with this is that you would be creating a state, right, a binational state, which means a state that includes two nations, right? And these two nations, Jewish and Palestinian, don't have an overarching common national identity, right? So let's say you could create this state and you call it Israelistan, right? It would be hard to imagine calling it Israel, since Israel is its actual sense and means the Jewish people, right? But you can imagine the Jews would not be very happy if you called it Palestine, right? So first you have to come up with a name, right? And just the difficulty of coming up with a name, I think, points to the basic challenge, right? Which is to say, no matter what name you create, most Palestinians are still going to be loyal to the Palestinian nation, and most Jews are going to be loyal to their Jewish nation, the Jewish community. And so then, under those circumstances, you have to think about, well, what is the army? How does the army of this country, how does the police force function? When you have a group of people that are essentially loyal to their communities, but not loyal to the state as a whole. And the danger in such circumstances, you could have a little bit like what was going on in Iraq after the US invasion, if you remember, which is you had the Iraqi army, but in reality what you had were rival ethnic and religious militias under one flag. The reason that people moved towards the idea of partition originally in the 30s and 40s was the fear that ultimately this would lead to civil war. And that's the argument for the two-state solution rather than one state, which is that binational states it's difficult to make binational states work because you don't have one overarching national identity that brings people together. Now maybe over time that could emerge, a common overarching Jewish-Palestinian national identity, but it certainly doesn't exist today.
Let's take two more questions, and if there are any non-students who have questions, we're happy to take those two. Let's go right there.
Thank you. You mentioned the sewage problem coming out of Gaza. Thomas Friedman had a column op-ed piece a couple of days ago about his solution to the Middle East. And he said the biggest problem is the shortage of water and the elimination of sewage. And what he said was that the model is in Western Europe, when after the war they sort of got together and created a half a century or more of peace. He said that the water solution could be solved by using the huge desert areas of Jordan along with the technology of the Israelis to produce water from sewage and from seawater, and this would satisfy everybody's needs. However, he said that the population has increased by such an enormous factor that if it continues, then the whole area is going to be sinking to its own sewage. What do you think?
I think you might be right. I mean, I think that those kind of innovative solutions where you bring people together to solve these common problems, I think are only really possible in a situation where people have basic rights, right? Otherwise, Israel can just take the water for itself. It has no need to ultimately share it, particularly with Palestinians, right? I think if you have a situation where Palestinians have a state of their own, they have rights, then I think they have they can work together with Israelis and maybe with Jordanians to solve common environmental problems like this. But I think otherwise, you won't have, there's no incentive for Israelis to do anything other than what they will do now, which is basically hoard the resources for themselves. Again, if governments are not accountable to people, because people are not citizens of the state in which they live, they will never have any chance of having equitable distribution of resources.
All right, I can see the audience getting antsy, so let's make this last one quick. Let's go to right there. We've got the mic.
First of all, thank you very much for a very, very informative and enlightening conversation. How much do you think that the Israeli policies and actions contribute to anti-Semitism outside of Israel? Or do you think?
Right, so the question was how much do Israeli policies contribute to anti-Semitism outside of Israel? I think we have to be, we have to be, I think, always very careful about suggesting that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism has emerged across millennia in many different places, regardless of what Jews do. I think that there is, and there's also some of the most virulent anti-Semitism we're seeing is actually by people who have no problem with the Israeli government at all, right? In fact, may even be, one of the really remarkable things, if you read some of the writings of some of these white nationalist killers, right, is essentially they don't have a problem with Israel because they like the idea of what they imagine to be ethnically homogenous states. They have a problem with diaspora Jews because they feel like Jews are undermining the homogeneity of the United States. But if Jews were in their place, they wouldn't have a problem with it. Now, I think it is true that Israel's policies produce a tremendous amount of anger and resentment, especially in the Arab and Muslim world. And some of that turns into anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, sometimes there is an inability to distinguish between the policies of the Israeli government and Jews writ large. And that can play itself out in hostility towards Jews. And I think that's a terrible thing. But I don't think that we should respond to that by saying that Israel bears the blame for that anti-Semitism. Israel bears the blame for its policies that violate basic human rights and core principles of liberal democracy and equality. The people who bear the blame for anti-Semitism are people who commit acts of anti-Semitism.
Wonderful. Okay, for the last one, we'll give you one more.
For the last one? Okay, thank you. So we came from Parkland, Hollywood. It's a long drive. So by our age, you can see we're a bunch of current and ex-hippies. We're Bernie people. We want to know how, since you did connect the relationship with what's going on understanding the progress of the Democratic Party in embracing a fair solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We live in a tri-county that's very heavy Jewish, yet conservative in its approach to Israeli politics. We were founders of the J Street Redwood chapter 10 years ago. And what advice can you give us to help move the needle, to help change some votes that may actually tip this state Democratic and help get rid of Trump and get sane policies with Bernie as president to really bring the two-state solution to the forefront? So we need your advice on what we can do. Canvas, what can we do to change the Jewish opinion here? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that in my experience, the thing that I've seen that has been most transformative for American Jews is when they actually have interactions with Palestinians. I think that there's something about always talking about a group of people without ever talking to those people that breeds dehumanization, that is actually kind of pathological. And I think a lot of American Jews don't even necessarily realize that they're dehumanizing Palestinians, but when they're constantly talking about Palestinians as this faceless mass of people who kind of get up in the morning and wanting to kill Jews, they end up basically doing exactly that. And I think whether it's actually going to the West Bank and seeing for yourself, or even reading a book by a Palestinian, or seeing a film by a Palestinian, or interacting with Palestinians, the face-to-face experience of the humanity of Palestinians, their Palestinians' ordinariness, the fact that Palestinians want the same set of things that anybody else does, including Jews, and then hearing people talk in personal terms about what their experience has been like for them or their families of lack of basic rights, I think often can cut through a lot of the language, the dehumanizing language that often, I think, circulates inside our community. So I think that's one very, very fundamental thing that I think that you can do and that we can do. I also think that I just would try to make the point that Israel ultimately cannot directly control millions of Palestinians in the West Bank. That right now Israel has a Palestinian Authority that acts as a kind of a subcontractor. So basically, Israel doesn't have to send all its 18 and 19-year-olds to patrol every Palestinian village and town in the West Bank. Right? Sooner or later, if there's not a Palestinian state, the Palestinian Authority will collapse and cease to exist. Palestinians did not sign up to permanently be the agents of their own occupation. They only created the Palestinian Authority because they thought it would lead them to the state. If there's not a Palestinian state, sooner or later Israel is going to be forced to go back to facing the prospect of directly occupying millions of people who don't want to live as colonial subjects under Israeli control. And sooner or later Israel will see that that's an untenable project for them. And so I think that that's a reality that we're insulated from now, but that will emerge sooner or later, and ultimately a Palestinian state in which Palestinians have rights and dignity and hopefully some degree of prosperity is not only in their interest, but ultimately it's the best thing for the safety of Israeli Jews.
Amazing. We're going to bring Isaac up for a second. You may have checked a box on your way in. We have a copy of Peter's book, The Crisis of Zionism, that we are giving out in a raffle, and he will sign it and make it out to you, and Isaac is going to announce the person that's getting it.
Yes, okay. The person who won a copy of Peter Beinert's book is... Lena.
Oh, she left.
She left?
We will have Peter make it out to her, and we'll make sure that she gets it.
Okay.
And thank you so much. And now we're going to bring up our VP, Angelica Fromer, and she's just going to give a few closing remarks. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. I want to first obviously start by thanking Mr. Peter Beinart for such an illuminating discussion on probably one of the most crucial conflicts of our lifetime. We are honored to host such an accomplished individual right here at our university. Now, moving forward, we really want to encourage everyone to reflect on what you've heard in this room tonight. And you might be asking yourself, what can we do, as we heard? So first of all, of course, vote Bernie, vote blue, do that, unscripted. And then second of all, we are really proud to announce that J Street has launched a new campaign which urges the Democratic Party to include formal opposition to Israel's ongoing occupation of the West Bank in their party platform. So incorporating this terminology that you heard tonight in the debates, in town halls, and all those things. So on college campuses nationwide, we aim to mobilize students to really highlight how the ongoing occupation tramples on Palestinian rights, imperils the prospects of peace for eternity, and ultimately runs counter to what we perceive as true democratic values. As of tonight, we are absolutely thrilled to also announce that Amnesty International of the University of Miami is signing on to our messaging and endorsing our campaign. And you too can be a part of changing discourse in Washington, so come to our meetings Thursday at 8 p.m. in the Vista Room and continue this open discussion. Ultimately, my closing remark is that J Street is pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and most crucially, it's pro-peace. Join us in integrating the comprehensive core of this issue into Washington, D.C. discourse, and we truly believe that this is the only way we can actualize peace. Thank you all for coming tonight.